Because I haven't seen all this information. So this would definitely be beneficial for a lot of people, looking to get into the field of being a paramedic. And
Heck yeah.
this one, I decided to make this episode based on a conversation we were having the other day. I'm not going to go too much into the conversation, but I came home and I was thinking about it. What is a bad paramedic? Right? Because we hear that
Hmm.
term so much. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, in your opinion, what do you consider a bad paramedic?
I mean, like everybody has their own opinion of what it really constitutes. Mine is formed more so around how you are as a person rather than how you are as a clinician, right? Obviously, I think that it goes kind of hand in hand. Like if you're a good person, you want to be good at the job, you want to, do right by people. All the reasons why we got into this field, like those are the kinds of people who are also going to stay up on their knowledge clinically. Like they're not the ones that are just going to like kind of like ignore the signs that like they're falling behind or like they're not the kind to like ignore feedback of like how to get better, like how to do stuff better, how to be good at their job. I think the bad paramedics start to come in whenever it's more of like a personnel problem, like you're not being a good person anymore, like who you are as a person has changed from who you were whenever you came
Mm-hmm.
in. I think that has a lot to do with it whenever I start thinking about like what it means to me personally, right? Like if I looked back at myself and I thought, man, I'm not being the same guy I used to be. Like I used to be the guy who wanted to be better and learned a lot and was like, constantly asking questions or wanting to improve. If I look back and I was like, I'm not that same guy anymore, that's whenever I think it's like, oh man, I messed up and it's time to get
Yeah, I
back
feel
on
like that's
track.
where it gets kind of tricky, though, right? Because you're talking about doing something to where you have to do a lot of self-reflection, and I feel like that takes a
Hmm.
tremendous amount of maturity to do, right? And honesty.
Right.
But not everyone, and this is for any profession, not everyone has the ability to do so. So some people may not think they're doing anything wrong. So how do you get someone to realize that, like,
Yeah, dude, we had that same kind of conversation the other day of like, there's a lot of stuff that you can learn about yourself and about interacting with other people, but it's all kind of based on the assumption that they care. And I think that's a big part of like, you talk about self-reflection, and the reason isn't just because I think it's fun to beat up on myself all the time. And like, I know that it's not a fun thing to go through. Like for people who are very self-reflective, the constant saying of like, oh yeah, I'm my own worst critic.
right?
It's like, it's not because it's fun to do. It's not because it makes me feel good. It's because I do want to get better and this is the path.
And there's
But
this
yeah,
saying that I always go by. I don't think I've told you it, but when it talks about like accreditation, that comes as a result of the
mhm.
work that we put in, but validation that comes from within. And that's something, man. To be honest, if I had to pick one thing I didn't like about EMS, I would say that because I kind of see it. For example, like having some of the advanced credentials that I have, and I almost hate telling people that I have them because I feel they look at me a certain way, like, oh, well, he must
Yeah.
know what he's talking about, but that's necessarily not true. Like, I could have that and still know nothing. But we were also talking about how in EMS, I feel like paramedics, the way we judge each other based off of mistakes,
Yeah.
and we're quick to label other paramedics as a bad paramedics, not knowing that that's like the negative culture that we're feeding into. So, like, is that
Yeah.
something that you see like on a case by case basis, or do you feel like it's global?
I was talking to somebody about this the other day while we were, talking about medicine, and specifically we're talking about having a toxic culture. Like if you're somewhere that has a toxic culture, if you're inside of it, it's not going to be super easy to see. But this is someone who had recently gone to a different place and then went back to his previous employer, and he was like, "Man, I realized for real that where he's at right now is very toxic." And we kind of talked about why. And one of my theories are like, you know how those conversations go in the Bay at
Yeah,
2 a.m. Like both of y'all
yeah.
should be sleeping. You like have a little bit of time, but you end up like talking some nonsense instead, thinking you're Socrates.
Yeah.
I had a Socrates moment, and so I thought about like all the ways that high performing EMS systems work is a lot of it's drilled into your head about we're operationally very sound, and a lot of operational decision making things are like highly scrutinized, right? Like we talk about shoot times or disciplinary actions, being a good person, blah blah blah, and a lot of that stuff is like directly disciplined, I think, very quickly by most employers, right? Like a lot of stuff in the fire department, so if you mess up something, like it's going to be talked about, like people are going to know about
Mhm.
it, right? But in EMS, it kind of changes because you throw in that clinical aspect too, where I think clinical mistakes generally are kind of punished less, right? Like you can mess up on a patient, you can genuinely chalk it up to, hey, I didn't know that before, I learned that now, and I'm going to be better in the future. Whereas a lot of operational things, it's like, I made a mistake or whatever, and there might be some disciplinary action. What we were kind of talking about specifically was operational mistakes are corrected by leadership or managers or whatever. but clinical mistakes, maybe the rest of the staff doesn't feel that that person was like, maybe I think it's kind of like we get in that culture of EMS eating our young, right? And so like someone's still learning, someone made a mistake, and it's in our culture, unfortunately, generally, to kind of like give them the jury of your peers punishment, right? Like we give them collective punishment from everyone else who's on the ambulance because we feel like managers didn't maybe punish them. So then it starts like kind of that trash talking, like nobody really does anything, but we say it because it feels good to say, like kind of more gossiping than actual construction, like constructive criticism, which is like very negative for someone who's already pretty self-reflective, and like they might be beating themselves up, or maybe a lot of times we don't know the outcomes, right? Like something changes, and that person could take all the ownership in the world, like I didn't know this before, but this is what I did to make it better, this is how I fixed it, and blah blah blah. But if you don't get the whole story and you just hear that somebody messed something up clinically, the instant reaction is to jump on them and kind of like enforce that crowd punishment or crowd justice, I
Right,
think.
and they'll just be walking around with that tag on them. Now, how much do you think
Yeah.
is based on like popularity and likability? So if someone who messes up clinically that's well liked versus someone who's not as well liked.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean it's definitely different, right? It's a whole different ball game. So if someone who is typically at the top of their game and everybody knows is like a very good guy and genuinely makes like an error in decision making or in treatments or whatever it is, I think that the willingness to give that person the benefit of the doubt is 100 times whatever it is if you don't personally like that
Mm.
person, right? Like if you don't personally like that person, then they definitely did it on purpose, and like you kind of lose the ability to see their side of things.
How's what are some things we can do to change that culture? And this is like culture that we create because we're all guilty of
Hmm.
it. And it wasn't until you
Oh yeah.
were telling me about it the other day that I realized, like, man, I'm guilty of that too. In the past, kind of perpetuating that culture. So, what are some of the things that we can do to like mitigate it?
I think that one of the first ways that I really saw of starting to mitigate stuff like that, and obviously we talk about being self-reflective, and the ability to see that in yourself is already a skill. But another one is like trying to put yourself in their shoes, right? Or like Dr. Covey. I don't know if you've read his book. You read Seven Habits of Highly Effective
I've
People?
heard about it now.
Yeah, so like one of his later law, I think it's like habit 5 or something like that, is to seek first to understand, right? And so like what I try to do specifically is put myself in their shoes. Like, could I have made that mistake? Probably, right? If I think about it logically and I really humble myself and get rid of my ego whenever I'm thinking about cases like this, I think the tendency in EMS is to backseat a call, right? So someone tells you a call and you're like, oh, I would have never done that. I can't believe, why did they possibly do that? Like, what were they thinking? And blah blah blah. But if you what I like to do is put myself into their shoes and understand the ways in which I could have made those errors, right? Or what led to those decisions being made. And I think if more people would kind of look back on themselves and realize that, and the likelihood of me doing that, if I put my ego aside, is actually a lot higher than I would like to admit it
Right,
is. Right? With my ego, it's like, oh, I would never misread like promethazine for something else. But, in practice, it's like, man, it can happen to
right.
anybody.
I think one thing that makes it hard too is because we work in a job where like the stress level is so high. I feel like sometimes that clouds like judgments that we make too, right? Because we're
Oh, yeah,
judging
definitely.
other people of things they do in stressful situations based on our understanding of stress too. So it's like we try to
Yeah.
take that factor out, and like you say, being an armchair quarterback, it's like, man, it's so hard to like take the stress out of that, and making these decisions.
Yep, for sure. And I think also like you see people who are also paramedics, right? So if I see another paramedic making a decision, I understand that, on the broad scale of things, we have the same credentialing, we have the same patch. In a lot of states where it's, state controlled medicine, it's like we follow the same guidelines. But specifically in Texas, where you have the chance to like kind of deviate a little bit and practice a little more based on your medical director, it's like you see them and you try to hold them to your standards rather than holding them to the industry standard, right? Or your company standard. Whereas like, if me and you were on the ambulance together, I have my own set of standards that are admittedly higher than most organizations would
Hmm.
be, but that's because I want to be better than most, right? And a lot of that is like, I think whenever people hear about someone else like making a clinical error, like whenever we start to talk bad about people, I think it's a lot to do with ego because we're on the same level as that person. Like we share the same job, right? Like if you're at a place that works with paramedics and basics and you hear about another paramedic doing that, you almost want to like kind of make yourself feel better by making sure that you wouldn't make that mistake, or like putting them down so you can be a little
Yeah,
higher because
self
there's not
self
that competition,
preservation.
right? Yeah, and there's one thing that I kind of had also the same realization is like if you're in a competitive environment, you're going to try to create like your own intrinsic scoreboard, right? And you think, oh, Gary messed up, so he just went down 3 points, right? He went from first place to fourth place, and now I can slide into third, right? Or something like that. And it's almost I think completely ego talking, but it's because there's not like a lot of differentiation between the two.
Is that kind
Where
of like when you keep scoring all the IVs that I miss? Yeah,
yeah, something like that. Yeah. It's the same situation. I just want to know your success percentage. It's called tracking data for
right.
improvement. That's all.
Man, and speaking about this term like bad medics, everyone has their their different criteria that they look at. I feel like clinically there's not a such thing as a bad medic because we've all been through medic school. We know how hard it is to make it there. So and pass the test. So I feel
Yeah.
like that just doesn't happen by luck. But I feel like I talk about ethics and morals a lot, and I think that's one.
And the
You
development
say it
of them,
again?
the development of those
Yeah,
ethics and
yeah,
morals.
right. So,
Yeah.
so that's one of
Getting
the things
better.
I judge when I look at other, not judge. One of the things that I look at when I see other paramedics is how they act in their worst moments, right? So
Hmm.
whenever they get written up, stressful calls, how they handle it is how I look at other medics. And more important, when you disagree with another coworker, like the way you speak to them and those aspects. So that's how I look at medics. Is like, would I want to work with him? You know,
Right. I think that's a good like eyeball test of like if we're on the ambulance together, would I enjoy that? Right? Like would I want to be their partner? Like yes or no?
man, what's that book that I'm reading? I ain't got it up here. It was called Leaders Eat Last. What's the guy's name? Simon.
Yeah.
What's his last name?
Simon
Right.
Sinek.
So he has. I don't know if it was on a TED Talk or just like a YouTube video. He was talking about the Navy SEALs, and
Hmm.
there was a chart, and he found that in a group or team, people would rather work with the nice guy who's or the guy that's easy to get along with, that's not as good as his job, versus working with someone who's
Hmm.
extremely good at their job but an a hole. So
Yeah. Yeah. And it's that what that applies 100,000% to EMS too, right? So I had a few years ago, the place that I work now is medic, right? So we're partners. We work paramedic, and that's kind of our standard. That's our expectation. A couple of years ago, whenever our shift bid happened, I got paired with an EMT who is finishing up paramedic school, and everyone their immediate reaction was, "Oh man, I'm so sorry you got paired up with him. That's gonna be so much work for you." Blah blah blah. But he's a fantastic
mhm.
dude, right? And he's a great dude to work with. We had a ton of fun. I actually mostly apologized to him for having to drive all day. Like, sorry, I can't downgrade
Yeah,
this one. Like I have to run this. This is an ALS call, but that was, and that's kind of what I preached for those, months before he got his paramedic is I don't really care about writing reports, right? I could do this job with really anybody as long as we can get through the calls and we can treat people and take them to the hospital and go back in service. That's the whole job. I can do it with really anybody. I don't have to like them, but my job satisfaction is so much higher if I do like them. And I can always teach him things, right? Like whenever he first got his paramedic, people said the same thing. Like, oh man, you got a brand new paramedic working with you. Like, it's going to be a lot to teach, blah, blah, blah. I was like, I would be more than happy to teach anyone who wants to know anything. Like, I don't know it all, but I know that I can help you. And as long as you're ready and willing to work and like you want to learn and be better and you have a good attitude, I can work with anybody on the
right,
ambulance.
right. I agree. So one thing I feel like goes hand in hand with quote unquote being a bad paramedic is a jaded paramedic.
Hmm. Yeah.
How do you think people become jaded? Do you think they come into the field already feeling a certain type of way, or does it happen over time? What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I guess it all depends on what you consider jaded, right? Like, what do you think is jaded? Like, are you saying this is like the same thing as like being burnt out?
Someone, in my opinion, someone jaded is someone who doesn't enjoy doing their job. They're just coming to collect that check. Um, they
Hmm.
don't really have an interest in self improvement or making anyone around them better. So just going through the
Yeah.
motions. I mean, I know being jaded is such a broad definition, but I feel like it goes hand in hand with quote unquote being a bad paramedic.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that the what I hope the goal is coming into it is new paramedics never want to be
Mm-hmm.
jaded, right? Like that's my that's my theory. I would rather believe that than not believe that people don't come into the field ready to be burnt out and not wanting to be good and all that. Like my genuine belief is that we get into this job for a reason and you could do anything else, right? Like there's another part of Simon Sinek that he talks a lot about like give people the why. He has a book called Start with the Why. And it's specifically about like, and then I went to a class recently, they talked about the why people get into EMS, and that's really what drives people. We talk about this a lot with recruiting to different departments of like, what can we do or say to get them interested? And it's like, you don't have to get them interested in being a paramedic. You just have to get them interested in working for, X agency, because ideally the EMS provider got into this for some intrinsic reason, because you're not going to get rich just being a paramedic. It's just not going to happen, right? Like you can work all the hours you want, but you're going to get burnt out eventually, like working that many hours. So you have to have a good reason to get into it, because you could do something else. But starting out that way, I think that there's a ton of different ways that it can go poorly. So I would say the number one reason it could go poorly is working with a bad partner or having bad like middle managers, right? Like having a bad captain or a bad EMS supervisor, someone in the middle, right? Not necessarily at the chief level, but still above you and responsible for like frontline people. That's a huge reason why people will get kind of like they'll start rolling down that snowball of getting jaded. And I think that the biggest thing is stopping it when it's a snowball and not the size of a boulder, of like, getting burnt out or getting jaded and kind of like losing your touch in the field. I think that's probably the number one reason that it happens, or number one way that it happens. But yeah, I think I have the same kind of opinion of like, someone who, my version of being jaded is, I think it's synonymous with burnout. And there's a lot of reasons why you can get burnt out. Like there's, so many.
So, all right, I'm gonna put you on the spot now. All right,
All
and the
right, hit
reason
me.
I'm gonna put you on the spot is because I feel like you have, I've had a lot of partners in the past, but I see some of like your leadership qualities, and there's no doubt in my mind that one day you're gonna have a leadership position based on you, not what you've seen from like other supervisors or chiefs, but what are some of the things that you feel like you can do and bring to the table to prevent burnout of medics, or like, and like you said, being jaded.
I think that a lot of it has to do with reminding people why they're here. Like I think, as callous as it may sound, of telling people that, hey, look, if you're not wanting to do this anymore, you're not going to be the same provider you were whenever you started, right? You're not going to be as sharp as you were. You're not going to be as good at what you do if you don't care as much. But I think that a lot of what I would personally focus on is preventing it from starting. And Dr. Rimley Crow, I think she works for ESO. She wrote a paper recently. I went to one of her talks about her big thing is data collection. She talks a ton about burnout. She like released a free study not too long ago for, she got published somewhere. And it's awesome. I went to her talk and it's like an hour long, and almost every behavior that she brings up, even if I didn't necessarily see it in myself, I could see how it could get there, right? Like I could see the origin of that. Like, we had that talk the other day. We were going to a call at like 2:30 in the morning, and I was like, man, this call is a career ender, right? Like this could be somebody's final straw, man. This could be it, right? Like if you're not ready for this and you're not, 100% sure where you are, you already got one foot out the door. Like this could be your last day, right? You could bring your own cake to your retirement party and announce it the same day, like that kind of last call. But I think that a lot of what I would do if I were in a leadership spot like that is, so Dr. Covey in that Seven Habits, the last habit, I think is something that I try to bring home pretty hard is sharpen the saw, right? Like there's a famous quote, I don't know who it's by, but it's like, if you had an hour to cut down a tree, what would you like? How would you spend it? Like, would you just spend 60 minutes just hacking away at this tree, no matter what axe you had? Or would you, and the famous quote is, I would spend the first 50 minutes sharpening my saw so that those 10 minutes of work were, as quick and as painless as it could be. And I think that in EMS, that's something we are famously bad at. We are not saying that, we're not good at what we do, or we're not training, but in EMS, I think that sharpening the saw for us means being able to detach from work and like recharge your batteries, because we work an emotionally, physically draining job, right? Even if you're not up all night, you could have, one call that just kind of hits home a little bit too hard, and you feel like your body just doesn't really want to move anymore. And I think a lot of it is, whenever he kind of talks about sharpening the saw, it's like taking time away to perfect your craft, whether it be, in EMS related, whether it be like through specific like studying or training or, something like that. But I think more of it is about taking care of yourself, right? Like eat good, work out, like take time off. And that's a big one. Take time off if you need it, right? Like you don't necessarily get all of the rest at work that you think you're going to get or you hope that you get, right? Like, so don't make it all about work all the time. Don't work 7 days straight. Like, I heard a horror story the other day from someone who worked in a nearby, relatively, fire department where there's, I guess, a little bit less oversight, and she worked for 12 days straight. I was like, imagine how dull your saw is going to be on day 12. You're not going to be ready to do anything. You're not going to be sharp. You're not going to be the same person you were on day one, right? That's you can take that to the bank. Like it's ain't
Yeah,
no
for
way.
sure. Man, see, to be honest, I feel like that was one of my problems. It wasn't necessarily about like working, being on the clock, but I had a hard. It wasn't until recently that I was able to get away and just shut everything off EMS related. Before, I'll go to work, I'll study, do homework, I'll come home. I feel like I would tell myself this that I want to be great in EMS. I don't know what it means, but I just want to be great in EMS, you know. So
Yeah.
whatever it is I have to do, so I'll come home, I'll bury myself in it. But then like it starts taking its toll mentally to where you can't avoid it. Like first, I believe when we start to have these problems, like we're the last one that sees it. Everyone else notices it before we does, but that's when it's too late. So I do
Oh
believe
yeah.
it's really important, man. Being in EMS, I believe it's a marathon, not a sprint. So you definitely have to take care of yourself.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that the word is overused for my taste, but the word that's thrown around a lot is resilience, right? And so like building up resilience to X problem, right? And for us, it literally is an everyday thing of building up resilience, making sure that you're going to be able to survive through the next problem that you're faced with. Whether it be in a clinical way, like I want to be clinically resilient, where I'm so prepared for every kind of call that I feel like worst case scenario, I have a fallback, right? I can fall back to my foundations, I can go back to my training, and I know that I can make it through this next call, whatever it is. Or it's just going through the motions of like going to work, right? Like mentally preparing myself and like setting myself up for success by putting myself in the kind of environment that's going to make me not have to fight for every hour, right? I don't want to be I don't want to put myself somewhere where it's like I'm looking at the clock and that thing ain't moving.
Yeah. Oh, so another thing I want to touch on is kind of like switching gears. So what you do a lot of like you're responsible for a lot of the recruiting. Is it like a committee?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, we have a committee. So I'm the chairman. We have a co-chair, and we've got like 20, 25
Okay,
members.
so a lot of people that watch this, they're going to be paramedic students or want to be paramedic. What are some of the important things that you stress whenever you go on these recruiting trips trying to recruit paramedics to the department?
Well, I think we've actually talked about a few of the things already. And like one of the biggest ones for me personally, whenever we go and talk to people, is I want to tell them what we're looking for. I'm not looking for the med school student who has a 4.0 GPA, who made 100 on every test. Like, I'm not interested in the test scores. I'm not interested in their clinical capabilities almost at all. I want to know that they can pass national registry. I want to know that they're coachable. And that's one of the most important things to me whenever we talk about this stuff. A lot of it refers back to like who you are as a person. And I think that being a good paramedic starts off with being a good person. So I want to, whenever we go out and we do these recruiting events, my number one thing that I tell people of what we're looking for is we're looking for good people. I'm looking for someone who's going to show up to work on time, who's going to do their daily tasks, who's going to, not just, throw all the supplies into the truck at 3 a.m. and close the door and call it good enough. Right? I want someone who's going to take time to learn, is not going to be like argumentative whenever someone tries to give them constructive criticism. And I want someone who, yeah, like I said, they just want to be there and they're ready to learn. Because one of the things that we say a lot is we can teach you medicine, like we can make you a paramedic, but we can't just make you a good person. If you show up ready to be a good person, we can help you with the other part.
Right. This, hearing you describe that. So like recently we've been having like a lot of students riding with us, and we're at a busy station, so we run quite a bit of calls. And I think one of the things that we look at is like not how good or how bad they're clinically, but like their attitude at
Yeah.
10 p.m. running like the 12th or
Oof.
14th call.
Yeah, even giving them until 10 p.m. is a bit of a
Right.
stretch sometimes. Sometimes people start down that hill at 2
But man,
p.m.
there's some people that get in there and like, it could be 12 at night or whatever time it is, and they still have like the same attitude from when they came in at 7 a.m. And I feel like that right there alone will equal to like longevity in EMS if you can keep that same attitude. Because I mean,
Yeah.
wherever you go work, you're gonna expect to run calls. You're gonna expect to wake up in the middle of the night. None of that's gonna change. So
Hmm.
we all know people who they get pissed off because they have to wake up at 4 a.m. Whatever the deal is, like I always tell myself, I'm there from 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. tomorrow morning. But whatever happens
That's
in
it.
between
They
there,
pay me for every
it
single
is what it
hour.
is. And I feel like that helps us have a good time at work too.
Yeah, yeah, and I think even for those students, a lot of like, it's said that it's you said that it's good that they have that, like they want to keep going, and I was like, it's good that they have it, but also they need to work hard to protect it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, don't let negative people like kind of cloud that because whatever it is inside of you that makes you want to do this job, like protect that at all costs, man. Because like you said, that equals longevity. Like it's a very linear thing, I would think. And I had a student not too long ago, and we both, I think you were there with me. He's the son of a lieutenant that we work with,
Mm-hmm.
and the first time he came and rode with me, it was me and somebody who I'd never really worked with before, and our first two calls of the day were both cardiac arrest. And I was looking at him like, man, you brought bad juju on my truck. This is bad. Like, you're bad luck, man. Like, this is gonna be a gnarly day. And we ran, dude. They got us good, right? And I was thinking he's gonna break at some point. It's his first ever EMS clinical. At some point, he's gonna be like, dude, is it always like this? But he never asked. He never, like, he was never upset that he didn't get to write down his paperwork. He wasn't trying to bring his laptop around and do reports, like, at inappropriate times. He was writing down what he needed. He got whatever he needed, and then he was immediately ready for whatever was happening next, whether it was going to be a house fire or an MCI or a fall lift assist. Like, that kid was ready to go. And what really got me was at about 4 a.m. I looked over at him, and I was sitting there typing my report, and he was still, like, he wasn't even reclined in the recliner, like, ready for a nap. That fool was sat forward. He was, like, typing a report on his laptop. And I looked at him, and I was like, "You sure you still want to do this?" And I was, like, trying to get a feel for him because I couldn't read him all day. He just, like, he was ready to go, and I was like, you're enjoying this, aren't you? And he's like, he got up from the chair and he didn't even say anything. He opened up the fridge and pulled out an energy drink and, like, cracked it open. He's like, I hope we get three more. I was like,
Yeah.
dude, we're 10 calls in, like 14 calls in, 17 calls in. It don't matter to him. He's ready to be here. He knows he's going to be here from 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. And whatever happens in between there, like, he's there to learn and help people
I
do
think we
whatever.
have a big responsibility in that too, not to kill students' dreams. When they come in
Yeah,
and they're excited to be there, I feel like we should encourage that instead of being like,
yeah.
oh, 5 years from now you're not gonna be looking at it like that. You're gonna be like this. So I feel like we have a huge responsibility in that. Some people may not look at it that way, may not even realize that they're doing that. Killing these students' dreams.
Yeah, I mean, what happens whenever, the type of person we're thinking of whenever we think bad medic, right? Like, those people are also preceptors. They're also going to get students. And what is the student's perception going to be of paramedics in the field if that's all they go to, right? Like, or people who want to come work for you afterwards. Like, what are they going to think of your department if, your people who are out there being preceptors are quote unquote bad paramedics? They're just always negative. They're down talking things. Like, that's not the type of person that breeds an environment of positivity and, like, trying to do their best and stay a good paramedic and, like, stay interested in all that.
So last thing I want to talk about before I let you head out, talking about preceptors. So with recruiting, do
Mhm.
you work hand in hand with the preceptors?
We don't work necessarily hand in hand, but we do also work with them. So the people who I work with at the higher end of recruiting, I talk to the chiefs a lot. I talk to, people in the aspect, like, people who are responsible for preceptors. So a lot of feedback that we get, or people on the committee, if we know that we have, X person, emails us and they're like, hey, we want to come work with you. It's not super difficult for me to get them assigned to a recruiting preceptor. And I think that's kind of like knowing that they're going to give off the best image of the department. And that's kind of like what you want from a preceptor, because a lot of organizations, and I think this is widespread, fire department is a little bit, kind of, I guess they don't have the same advantage because they don't have, firefighters come do ride-alongs with them. One advantage that we have is we get to give people kind of like an insight view of our department, and they kind of determine in their mind, like, oh, is this somewhere where I could see myself working or not, right? Would I be happy on an ambulance here or not? Does this place have good paramedics or not? And recruiting from your preceptors is a huge tool, and we have plans to make that connection a lot tighter in the future than it is right now. But that's something that we've really identified as being extremely valuable, like a very good resource or very good asset to have, is preceptors who are happy to say good things about the department, because students coming through are one of our number one recruiting tools. Like, they get a view of our department and hopefully they like it. So hopefully they'll, kind of already have an idea of what's going on, like a view of the department or their kind of perception of it, so that whenever they come into it, it's a little easier.
Obviously, preceptors, man, they play such a huge role when it comes to recruiting because whenever these students they come do their ride-outs, that's something that they don't forget. Like being in EMS
Yeah.
almost 10 years, I can still tell you about my EMT ride-outs. And
Yeah, my first ever clinicals are burned into my
yeah,
brain. Like, my first ones, my good ones, and my terrible ones. Like, I still remember them, 5.5 years
right. So
later.
that's definitely a huge responsibility. So, man, I definitely appreciate it being on here.
Yeah, man,
Is there
absolutely.
any last piece of advice you want to give someone, EMT student, medic student, to help them out in their career?
I think that kind of like what we talked about already, but just to kind of bring home, the most important thing for me is making sure that you're staying a good person and you're still happy with your own performance. You're still, going to the job for the right reasons. You're not just showing up for a paycheck. Take time for yourself. If you need some time to take off. I worked with one of my previous partners. He would, I think I told you this the other day. He would literally go into his schedule and he would
Mhm.
surprise himself with PTO. Like he would just like once every couple months he would just take a shift off and he wouldn't even realize it until like the day or two before. He wouldn't have any plans. He just like kind of like a treat yourself kind of day. Like he said he was gonna walk around in a tank top and
Hey,
smoke a
there you
cigar. Like he was just gonna
go.
he's gonna take some time, sharpen the saw. I think that's a really important part of making sure that you're still ready to come back to work because make no mistake, whenever we're at work, that is 100% tree cutting. Like all 24 hours, that's
Oh,
work.
absolutely.
We might have some downtime, but then you have to deal with somebody like Gary at the station, always doing
Always
whatever.
ready to go.
That's it. Just biting, chomping at the bit, boy.
Hey, well, again, man, I definitely appreciate it. And I might have to get you
Absolutely.
on here again to talk about all things paramedic, see how it
Yeah.
goes. All
Yeah. We'll
right.
see.